this is a story not about what went wrong, but what went right. Just. It's a story of everyday life. There are no heroes, villains, or extreme operating conditions. The driver remembered having had the best night's sleep for a long time. And he arrived 20 minutes early. He used the time to read the latest notices, including those about a recent SPAD. And it's here that the first trap lies. Ordinariness, or the absence of accidents, is not the same thing as safety. The journey to the London terminal passed uneventfully, and the service arrived on time. Then came the first and only technical failure. The cab secure radio registered the area code, but would not display the head code.
Hello.
The driver was anxious not to leave late and called the signaller for advice.
Seem to be having problems this morning with the DOO radio.
He was told that there were problems with the CSR system, which technicians were attempting to remedy.
So try it one more time, and if I fail again, then get back to you. Okay, then will do. Thanks very much.
The driver tried again, but without success. So he checked with the signaller that it was okay to leave with only the area code displayed. He was new to the train operating company and had clocked up 150 hours after training, where he achieved excellent results. Training had covered the full use of CSR and had a particular emphasis on the route where the incident occurred. Moreover, he'd done 200 driver hours with his previous company.
Will do then.
In other words, he was just the kind of person any operator would be very glad to have on the team. As a result of the conversation with the signaller, and in accordance with the rule book, the train left the terminal without the radio fully set up. The driver's intention was to input the information at a later opportunity. While this kind of thing doesn't happen every day, it's not infrequent. On the surface, nothing remarkable, but in reality, the first flaws are beginning to appear. During the journey, the driver kept trying to set up the radio. He expected to see the area code change automatically from 1 to 2, but it didn't. In those circumstances, the rules call for the driver to carry out the change manually. This didn't happen. The train stopped at an intermediate station and left on time. At 53 miles an hour, the train approached signal Sierra November 225, which was displaying a double yellow. The driver shut off the power, then he began to apply the brakes and was slowing as he passed Sierra November 233, which showed a single yellow. The next signal was at red. The driver approached at 2 miles per hour. This seemed an ideal opportunity to set up the CSR. Then the signal changed to a single yellow. He entered the signal number and took power. The setup attempt failed, and he decided to wait until the next station to try again. Meanwhile, the train speed increased. Approaching Sierra November 243, the driver saw the flashing lights of an emergency speed restriction indicator, which referred to the main line. The AWS magnet was shared by the emergency speed restriction indicator. With his attention diverted by the speed restriction, the driver cancelled the AWS warning, but missed the red signal. TPWS activated emergency braking. The train came to a stand some 180 yards past the signal and just 50 yards short of an almost certain collision. The train, directed by automatic route setting, was crossing over to the main line. Look at this succession of relatively ordinary events again. A conscientious but inexperienced driver who wants to leave on time has trouble with the cab secure radio. Clearer instructions to the signaller on the advice he should give the driver who's reported such a failure could have made it plain that the correct course of action was to set up the radio at the next stopping point, not on the move. A red light that seems to offer an opportunity to set up the radio, but changes to a yellow in the middle of the process. The distraction of an emergency speed restriction indicator close to the red signal. All of these things combine to provoke a very dangerous SPAD. When something that serious happens, there are a lot of people who need to know why. The aim is to find the answers to 3 questions. What happened? why it happened, and how do we stop it happening again? Of course, getting answers to all these questions is vital. But there's a fourth question. What does all this mean about the businesses that we're running and the systems that we operate? Without facing this question, we will never get the consistently changed outcomes we all want to see. Professor James Reason, one of the world's leading experts in managing human error, invented a way of understanding this that has become familiar in many high-hazard industries.
Every organisation that engages in dangerous activities has some idea of what the hazards are. For the sake of argument, let's call these the hazards. They also have people, valuable assets, possible losses, possible victims. Let's call the plums the losses, the possible losses. In an ideal world, the organisation would build defences that intervene between the hazards and the possible losses. And in that ideal world, those defences would be made of something like this, something like this slice of cheddar cheese. But in reality, however, it's much more like Swiss cheese. They have holes, so that there are occasions in which the hazards can come into contact with the possible victims. Now, most organizations have defenses in depth, many slices of cheese. So it's very unlikely that this coming together would happen. But every now and again, the holes line up so that there can be some trajectory of accident opportunity.
It's a good description of us. We have well-proven defences based on decades of experience and new thinking. Any one of these might have prevented the incident, but each had a flaw. Rules didn't clearly foresee this combination of circumstances. Technology, like CSR, designed to improve safety, can also be the cause of problems. In even the best of working cultures, the worst things can happen to the most dedicated of people. Training may not cover everything and occasionally leave an inexperienced individual dealing with a situation which is new to them. Clearer advice from the signaller could have made it plain that the correct course of action was to set up the radio at the next stopping point, not on the move. The placement of the ESR warning for another line, but using the same AWS magnet for the signal, may have been efficient in terms of resources, but in safety terms, was it effective? So, what does all this mean for us? Relying on a good safety record can be dangerous because it means we're measuring safety only by its occasional absence, not by the system's resistance to failure. It was no accident that there was no accident at Sierra November 243. TPWS, the last defence, held. It's as simple as this. When everything else failed, TPWS prevented a major collision. Its implementation across the network is a powerful example of investment in safety.
Currently we have on Network Rail around about 14,000 applications of it to about 11,000 signals and 1,200 PSRs and about 650 buffer stops. Rolling stock, I believe there is around about 5,500 train cabs that are now fitted with the equipment.
Is it a perfect system? Of course not. Was it simple to introduce? We all know it wasn't. Could it be improved? Certainly. There are technical and practical issues that need to be addressed. TPWS is out there now, making the railway safer on a daily basis. So, it's all good news, isn't it? Well, it would be, except for one thing that at first sight is astonishing. In some 10% of TPWS interventions involving a SPAD, the driver cancelled the warning and carried on.
There are two basic reasons that drivers reset and continue without authority. One is that they've made a genuine mistake. They don't know that TPWS has acted to stop their train. There are 16 or 19 different things that could stop a typical train. So knowing what it was can be difficult, and the TPWS equipment doesn't tell you unambiguously. The other problem is drivers doing what's called violating, that's breaking the rule. They know TPWS has acted, but they decide that it's in the better interests of their train and their passengers in the system to reset the system and carry on, rather than stopping and reporting that might delay their train for 20 or 30 minutes.
And when TPWS was first introduced, especially on buffer stops, we were all told it was set for 15 miles an hour or below, and drivers were getting tripped at 12, 13 miles an hour, being taken off, med screen, whatever, and we've since found out afterwards some of them were set for 5 miles an hour, and it's still on your record. You've activated a TPWS.
A lot of drivers feel that TPWS causes unwarranted brake applications and that it's unreliable as a system. And this perception is leading to part of the violations that are contributing to reset and continue incidents. We know that there are problems with the reliability of the system. However, these issues have significantly improved. I'm not sure that the drivers are aware that things have improved, and that's something else that we need to deal with, the perception.
Where drivers are put under severe pressure by the intervention of TPWS, when they're actually doing nothing wrong, they're braking normally for a speed restriction, and this piece of equipment intervenes and they're doing something quite legally in their approach to this speed restriction, then we must see that there could be a temptation for them, especially if the train is not fitted with an OTMR, which quite a few units still aren't fitted with, to literally shut the cab down, reopen it, and off they go, and nobody will be any the wiser.
The procedure a driver has to follow after TPWS has acted is that first he must contact the signalman. Now, not all trains have a telephone or a radio in the cab, so the driver may have to get out of the train and use a signal post telephone. He might have to walk a long way to do that. So even before he's rung the telephone, there could be several minutes. Then the signaller answers. The signaller goes and gets a form which he's now going to fill in discussion with the driver. He uses the same form and the same process for any TPWS activation.
I mean, TPWS, from a signaller's point of view, is very straightforward, and I can imagine from a driver's point of view it can look very black and white. Unfortunately, when we get the nod that TPWS has been activated, if it's an overspeed sensor, such as on a PSR, permanent speed restriction, then we do go down the road of a 3189 form, which I can understand what you're saying about it. You know, it's almost looking like we're saying you're spatted and you haven't, sort of thing.
Once TPWS has intervened, then we have to go through all the procedures as per rules and regulations.
He fills in this form talking to the driver, mostly collecting information the driver knows about and the signalman doesn't know anything about. So it's quite difficult for the signalman to get it right. He then faxes that form to the control centre. The control centre fax it to the TOC. The TOC consider whether they think the driver should be relieved of duty or should carry on. The TOC fax back to the control centre, who fax back to the signalman, who then gets back in touch with the driver and says, OK, you can now move your train forward. It's a Byzantine process, and it's quite appropriate if there's been a serious incident like a SPAD. Then there's a real concern that the driver could be very shaken up. There could be a very good reason he shouldn't continue the journey. But it's unthinkable when it's not a SPAD. And for 98% of TPWS activations, it isn't a SPAD.
99 times out of 100, on mainly not to do with, again, the red signal activation, but the overspeeding on a permissible speed, that you do get down this line of, well, by the time I get back to my depot, am I going to be taken off, med screened, and then have points on my licence for, realistically, I was braking in terms of the characteristics of my train. I was braking well down for the speed limit. Because I know in certain locations where these TPWS have been fitted, that was the actual braking point used for the permissible speed. So unfortunately the first few guys who went over those speeds got hit, and they were the ones who one or two, the honest ones reported it and reported themselves, and they ended up carrying the can, all the ones after that have then sort of, not to say they learned their lesson, but if they can get away with it, they have.
We are also looking at how we could reduce the possibility of unwarranted interventions through possibly removing TPWS at PSRs and buffer stops. A decision is yet to be made about this, but it's one of the options we're considering.
If a driver has a TPWS activation at a terminal platform and he can see that the route ahead to the platform is clear and is properly set, he would be given the authority on his own say-so to move the train forward to the platform and then report the incident to the signalman. Now, the second process that would work anywhere across the network is that when the driver rings up the signalman would first check with the driver whether a SPAD had occurred. That doesn't happen at the moment. But it's a very useful check, because if a driver doesn't think he's had a SPAD, that's the mindset that we're really worried about for this issue. If there has been a SPAD, they go into the full process. But if there hasn't, then there's a very minimal form, and on the authority of the signalman, there and then in that telephone conversation, he can release the driver and tell him he has authority to continue. The other group of changes are to the TPWS equipment to give the driver a better indication that TPWS has acted, a very clear and unambiguous one, and also to close off ways that he can reset the system.
We know that the TPWS system is indistinguishable from the AWS system, and the solutions that we're looking at will be equipment changes to actually make the systems distinguishable in terms of an alarm and in terms of the acknowledgement. So there would be an active process for acknowledging which system has intervened.
The aim of these changes is to do two things. The first is to help the driver know unambiguously when TPWS has stopped his train. And the second is to make sure that we only have one way to reset TPWS, and that way will be detectable afterwards. So what's being proposed is that the TPWS equipment would be left largely unchanged except for the logic chip at the heart of the controller, so that TPWS the equipment would behave differently. And if TPWS rather than AWS has acted, the driver would get a distinctive visual indication on his panel that it was TPWS, not AWS. He would get a distinctive audible indication through an intermittent AWS horn. He would have a distinctive operation to acknowledge the alarm by a protracted press down of his AWS button. And finally, he would have to get up from his seat and go and operate the TPWS isolation switch, and that would be the only way to reset TPWS. We would abolish the 60-second automatic timeout.
In many cases, had we not have needed the system so quickly, we may have made some of those changes earlier in the design, but the changes really are about changing the driver's information that's provided to him when he has had a TPWS intervention, changing the rules and instructions to make it easier for drivers and signallers to talk to each other so they can kind of phone a friend and get assurance that the risk has been mitigated, and really push those changes forward as quickly as possible.
We made a commitment as an industry at the time to implement it a year earlier, which means that it was really done in quite a great deal of haste.
From the driver's point of view, in the event of an unexplained brake application, always consider that TPWS may have braked your train and rule this out first before continuing with the other aspects of fault finding. Always consider that TPWS could have braked your train, and if that is the case, always contact the signaller.
As a result of the introduction of TPWS, right across the network, we're clearly looking at a much safer railway.
Well, the benefits of TPWS I don't think have really been evident, and to certain people it's been seen as a nuisance, but the reality of life is that it's saved lives of people. At least 5 or 6 or 7 SPADs have occurred where TPWS has it's saved the driver's life, it's saved the passenger's life, and it's really saved the industry's reputation.
TPWS is probably the most significant contribution to safety on the rail network for, perhaps ever.